Okay, hi, welcome back everyone. I hope you had a good break. We will now be moving on to our third session, which brings together representatives of both major US political parties. So our first speaker in this session is going to be Ms. Chaya Haupt, the chair of Democrats Abroad in Israel. Ms. Haupt, the floor is yours.
Hi, Diplomats Club. So, how's everybody feeling about the United States at this point in the program? About democracy in general? Yeah. I would imagine that after having some lunch, maybe it feels a little bit better. Hopefully that helps somewhat. My name is Chaya Haupt. I am the chair of Democrats Abroad Israel, and I want to thank Dr. Yonker for inviting me. And thank you, Maria, and also to acknowledge our vice chair of Democrats Abroad Israel, who's here, Louis Rowan. So just to give you a sense of who we are, DA Israel is the local country committee of Democrats Abroad, which is an international organization representing millions of Americans living outside the United States. And DA functions as an official state party within the structure of the Democratic Party in the United States. And our goal as Democrats Abroad is to give Americans abroad a voice in the democratic process, a voice in government, and to help elect Democratic candidates by mobilizing the overseas vote. And we do this by helping Americans abroad register and vote, and by advocating for their rights, and by building communities of like-minded Democrats around the world. In Democrats Abroad, we are people who, wherever we may be living, connect to the values outlined in the official charter of the Democratic Party, which views democratic government as a force for good and a source of hope. And I'm going to quote directly from the charter, actually, because I love it and I find it very moving. At the heart of our party lies a fundamental conviction that Americans must not only be free, but they must live in a fair society. We believe it is the responsibility of government to help us achieve this fair society. So these are the principles that motivate our participation in this process, even when we are living outside of the United States. And every part of Democrats Abroad is volunteer run, from small local committees, local country committees like ours, to global initiatives. And we have 52 country committees across 6 continents, and reaching members in over 190 countries. We maintain the website votefromabroad.org, where all Americans anywhere can request their ballots and vote absentee. Every 4 years, we hold a global primary to help choose the Democratic presidential nominee, and we cast our votes at the Democratic National Convention. And we organize local events to bring our members together and build community. And members of Democrats Abroad can collaborate with peers and leaders to protect voting rights and advocate for policies that matter to our members and are particular to the interests of overseas voters, like residence-based taxation, Medicare portability, and more broadly to ensure that the Democratic Party remains transparent and representative. But if I may, I have to acknowledge that it feels a bit surreal and a bit disconnected to be telling you about Democrats Abroad as though these were just normal times, because as the topic of today's program suggests, we are doing this work at a time of great uncertainty. And I think we have to ask if it's appropriate in this moment to just plug along as we have, clinging to institutions and investing in this small, quiet work of democratic participation. I think that that's a real question. And this is especially true for Americans in Israel, speaking generally about the membership of Democrats abroad. So globally, we're talking about expats working abroad for tech, diplomacy, NGOs, academia, multinational companies, students studying overseas, members of binational families, retirees, military and government employees, aid workers, journalists, and Americans who are living abroad maybe just for a short period of time. And we have all of these members in Democrats Abroad Israel too. But Democrats Abroad Israel is distinctive in the sense that while our members fall into those categories, a large number of us are people like me, dual citizens who have chosen to settle permanently in Israel, and still we remain politically engaged with the United States. And this also includes people like my children, and I brought my daughter Adi with me here today. Hi, Adi. Adi is an American citizen who was born in Israel, and her oldest siblings, my twin daughters, were born in the United States and came here as children and are now eligible voters in the United States. Democrats Abroad Israel members are, for the most part, people who feel deeply connected to and engaged with the government and political landscape of both countries, and especially with the well-being of our families and friends in the United States. And we're looking now at what is happening in that political environment right now, at how much uncertainty there is, and even peril, and wondering what the future is going to hold. And to just give a few examples, we're deeply concerned about the rise in state violence, in aggressive policing of protests, and the expanding use of force against civilians. We're concerned about cruel enforcement of immigration policy, including prolonged detention and denial of due process. We are concerned about the erosion of reproductive freedom and of shrinking economic opportunity. And in general, if I can sort of put it into a phrase of, this widespread greed and corruption, undermining of the public trust due to concentrated wealth, corporate influence, weakened oversight. I could go on, but we are I caught a bit of the last session, and we are also particularly alarmed by the rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, which includes the conflation of criticism of Israel with attacks on American Jews, and this increase in hateful rhetoric, and the growing tendency to normalize and excuse anti-Jewish views. And for some of us, this is even raising doubts about the long-term safety of Jewish life in the United States. And of course, we also worry about the future of the US-Israel alliance, with the possibility that this relationship has been transformed, is being transformed into just one more polarizing issue in a calcified political landscape. And this anxiety, of course, is not limited to one side. On the right, we have this emerging isolationist trend among Republicans, which also casts doubt on the future, but I will leave that part to your next speaker. As American Democrats living in Israel, we see these trends, and we naturally want to know, looking forward, what is going to happen. Which way are the winds blowing? What are the implications of each new development, and how it will impact our lives here in Israel and the lives of our loved ones in the US? And so this is what I want to suggest. If we are looking to be reassured or guided by expert predictions or by assurances from candidates and elected officials, we're looking in the wrong place. At a time of uncertainty, it is really tempting to treat political analysis as though it were a crystal ball, to cast around for answers that are going to be able to calm our fears and give us a sense of what might lie ahead. But when we limit ourselves to this level of political engagement, we remain passive, powerless, and anxious. And so I believe that what is most important right now is actually to get involved personally, to make a positive contribution to the political process, and to become an active participant in democracy. And so I'd like to share with you how I got here, how I came to be chair of Democrats Abroad. I'm new to this position. I came into this role last summer. And I haven't even been involved with the organization for that long, although I am a lifelong Democrat from the cradle. Since I made Aliyah to Israel with my family 15 years ago, I've been voting in presidential elections, using the tools of Vote from Abroad to cast my vote from overseas. And that was pretty much the extent of my participation in US politics, other than being, a total political obsessive and following American politics very closely, but mostly as a passive spectator. And when that began to change for me was when, in the 2024 presidential election, when Kamala Harris took over the top of the ticket, I reached out to Democrats Abroad to find out how I could get involved. I didn't want to just wait to cast my vote in November. I wanted to be able to make an impact. And Democrats Abroad Israel was not an active country committee then at the time, so I joined together with a small and dedicated group of volunteers, and we started doing everything we could in that accelerated time period to try to reach out to Democrats in Israel. And so what did we do? We trained in voter support. I quickly learned about all of the different election laws for all 50 states, and I learned how to help fellow Democrats submit their ballots, which this process of obtaining a ballot, submitting all the different laws for each state, because it's not centralized in the United States. This process previously for me had been like a little overwhelming and opaque. And so now I had the opportunity to be helping other people who were finding the process that way, and to be able to give answers and be here on a local level. And it was able to guide other Americans, help them participate, help them make a difference. We set up tables on the sidewalk and helped passersby navigate the process of voting from overseas in areas where there were a lot of American citizens living. And I felt during those intense final months of the campaign that I was doing everything that I could to try to elect a candidate that I believed in, rather than just waiting to see what happened. And so then what happened after the election? So that was not the outcome that we wanted. And of course I was disappointed, and I was fearful of what lay ahead, but I also knew that there was only one possible way that I could have felt worse at that time, and that would be if I hadn't done anything, is if I had never gotten involved at all. And so when the opportunity came to run for office in our newly reformed Committee of Democrats Abroad Israel, I decided to stay in the fight. And that is what has led me to this moment of addressing you all today. I'm not professionally involved in politics. I'm a mother, I'm a writer, and I'm an American citizen, and that comes with privileges and responsibilities. And I'm determined to exercise my rights and to help my fellow voters do the same. I'm not going to worry and wonder about what happens next. I'm going to do everything that I can to be part of shaping the future. So, at a time of great uncertainty, the thing about it is that there is also great potential in that uncertainty. So much has changed in the world in the past few years, and all of that change means that there are new possibilities, there are new opportunities that didn't exist in the world before. And for Democrats abroad in Israel, that means that there is room for optimism and for hope. I feel really strongly that this kind of participation is the antidote to despair. That has been my experience, and that is the understanding that Democrats Abroad Israel is going to bring to this moment. Coming into the present, we're now at the outset of what we expect to be a consequential year in American politics. The midterm elections in the United States lie ahead. We know how important it will be to elect senators and representatives who will serve as a meaningful check on the Trump administration, so we're getting to work. We are going to register overseas voters here in Israel. We are going to phone bank to invest in educating and supporting voters, and we're going to back candidates who share our values and our aspirations for the future of the United States. And to put this work in a specific and local cultural context, I'd like to take the liberty of injecting a bit of timeless Jewish wisdom into an otherwise secular topic. I want to tell you that we are not just starting the midterm election cycle now, but in the Hebrew calendar, we are also about to begin the month of Shvat. Shvat is the month in the Hebrew calendar when we focus on the planting of trees. And we recognize how that planting carries us forward into a hopeful future in doing the work that will make the world better for the people who come after us. There is an ancient text of Rabbi Natan that I think about a lot these days, which says that, okay, here's the scenario. You're in your field, you're in the middle of planting a tree. You've got the sapling, the baby tree in your hand, and someone comes up and tells you, good news, the Messiah has arrived, the world is about to be transformed, everything is changing. You know what? If that happens, the text continues, keep planting the tree. Finish your work. Plant the tree, then go greet the Messiah. And what that says to me is that when everything is changing, we might feel that simple acts are inconsequential. No matter, in a time of upheaval, dramatic global churn, it's important, no matter what is happening, no matter what is on the horizon, that we keep planting. We keep doing the prosaic, hopeful work of trying to make an active difference, of preparing for the future in the most concrete way, in the way where we personally have agency. And in continuing to plant, and which in this context means mobilizing the overseas vote, building alliances, educating our children and our fellow citizens, that doesn't mean living in denial, doesn't mean ignoring looming threats. It is work that flows instead from our deep faith in the democratic process itself and in the redemptive role of participation, of action, and of staying engaged. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'm going to shortly turn the floor over, but if anyone has questions about anything I've shared, I can stick around.
Okay, if no one has any questions, we'll move on to the next speaker. Okay. So now we'll go to the other side. Our next speaker is Mr. Mark Zell. He's the chair of the Republicans abroad in Israel. Dr. Zell, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Professor Shavit and particularly Professor Carl Jonker, who was able to get us into the campus of the university and find us a parking place just at the last minute. No easy task. You could be a great member of the Trump administration, I think. You get things done. We are Republicans overseas Israel. We're not Republicans abroad. That organization went out of existence about 14 years ago. Just as the Democrats Abroad organization went out of existence in 2023, and Chaya, who spoke very eloquently here, and I want to thank her for her very excellent remarks, didn't mention something very important about Democrats Abroad Israel. You all know what happened on October 7th, 2023. And so did the Democratic Party. Democrats abroad all over the world also knew what happened on October 7th, 2023. And they did absolutely nothing nothing to comment about the atrocities that were perpetrated against our people and the others that were involved in the attacks on the Gaza envelope on that day. As a result, and to their credit, the board of directors of Democrats Abroad Israel resigned en masse. And that brought an end, at least for the next couple of years, to Democrats Abroad Israel. And that has something that tells you something about the Democratic Party and where they stand when it comes to issues that are dear to our heart, the survival of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. They simply don't care. Now, I give Chaya a lot of credit. She used the word despair to describe her state of mind and the hope that it could improve. Yeah, she has reason to despair. And the Democratic Party is the reason for that. I invite Chaya to reconsider her lifelong, from cradle to the moment, status in the Democratic Party, to join the Republicans overseas Israel. We're part of a community here in Israel which consists of more than 500,000 United States citizens. This is more than some 10 states in the American Union have to vote. It's an extraordinary number. And it makes Israel, even though, as Chaya mentioned, we're a little tiny country, when it comes to American electoral politics, we are a giant. And interestingly enough, in the 2024 election, which Chaya and her colleagues tried to get into at the very last minute, some 300,000 American citizens voted, and over 90% voted for Trump and Vance and the Republican candidates in that election. Now, this is very unique among Jews, as you know, not only among Jews in the United States, but also Democrats abroad around the world. Most of their voters are Democrats. Not so here. And there's a reason for that. When I first came here in 1986, there was no Republican organization. In 1991, 92, we formed Republicans, then it was called Republicans Abroad, became later Republicans Overseas, and we began from scratch. All the voters here in Israel were confirmed Democrats like Chaya from their birth. And in fact, that's what I was too when I first became able to vote an age ago, back in 1971, as a student at Princeton University. I registered as a Democrat, because that's what Jews did. That's what Jews do. But when I learned later on the true face of the Democratic Party as it has evolved, or perhaps the word is devolved over these past decades, I learned that the home for Jews is not in the Democratic Party, but in the Republican Party, which espoused the Jewish people and has continued to support the state of Israel, notwithstanding the growth of progressivism and wokeism in the Democratic Party, which is now typified by such candidates as AOC Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, a Democratic representative from the Bronx, originally from Westchester County, and the new mayor of New York City, Mamdani, whose views on Israel, Zionism, anti-Semitism are well known and really characterize, sadly, the current state of the Democratic Party. Look, it's a profound honor for me to appear this day at this seminar and to here at the Irwin Cotler Institute. Irwin Cotler, Professor Cotler, is a good friend of mine, and we worked together on a number of cases, including a recent set of cases in the United States Supreme Court on behalf of Holocaust victims from Hungary. I really count him as one of my most esteemed colleagues and mentors. Now, I had a problem with the way this conference today was entitled. I think the title is The United States in the Age of Disorder. That fits in with the Democrats' view of despair in our day. but I would call it something else. America leading in the era of renewal, of change, of hope. And who better than we here in Israel, witnessing what's going on around us in this region, can testify to the prospects for a new Middle East. A new Middle East, in fact, a new world that reflects the resurgence of strength and stability and prosperity we hope we'll realize soon, we'll soon know in the days to come, under Republican leadership. I understand that Chaya is prohibited, she told me, from discussing foreign policy issues here with you today. I don't understand that. The very questions that we in Israel are facing are essentially those of foreign policy and the relationships of the United States with the State of Israel and the Jewish people. How can we avoid that? How can the Democratic Party avoid that? You know, as an American Israeli, I'm almost 73 years old, a bit older than Chaya, father of 8, grandfather of 24, all of whom reside in Israel. And all my children have served in the IDF, Tzahal, or in national service in the case of a daughter. That status has shaped my deep commitment to both the United States and Israel, and is the reason why for the past almost 40 years, this will be 40 years since I made Aliyah, 40 years working to rebuild or build a Republican organization in this country, because I believe the views of the Republican Party needed to be expressed, and the electorate needed to be energized to vote. Over those years, all those Democrats that I originally met here have become Republicans. And this country is among the countries in the world. We also have 50 some chapters around the globe in the Republican Party, but Israel's the leading country for Republican voters. It's amazing. Even the Republican Party leadership finds it extraordinary that we were able to do this, accomplish this in a relatively short period of time. Now, I like to focus in the moments that I have. I've got a lot to say, and I probably won't have enough time to say it, but I like to focus on the triumphs that the Trump administration has accomplished over the past year. It's just going to be a year on Monday, I think, since it's been in office. Really earth-shaking. And on the failures of the party that Chaya has decided, I think, incongruously to support, of the previous administration. She decided to support Kamala Harris for the presidency of the United States in 2024, a decision that I find that borders on the insane. But we've overcome the deficits of the Biden administration, Biden-Harris administration, and we've turned the world, through the efforts of President Trump, on its head in a positive way. One of the administration's hallmark triumphs has been in foreign policy, Dafka, where Trump's doctrine of peace through strength has delivered breakthroughs that eluded the Democrats, beginning with the historic Abraham Accords during the Trump 1 administration. The current administration has turbocharged normalization efforts in the Middle East. We've seen deepened ties between Israel and additional Arab nations. We see what the president is doing now with Iran. Now in fact, I'm going on to do an interview on one of the TV stations after this lecture today to discuss, I'm sure, what exactly is happening with the American administration in Iran. I'll tell you what I will say on the television program, and that is I have full confidence in the President of the United States and to keep his word to support the demonstrators now rebelling against the Islamist regime throughout Iran in 31 different cities. He has dispatched, even as we sit here, 3 major carrier groups from the China Sea, with in case of the USS Abraham Lincoln, and 2 other carrier groups that have left Norfolk Naval Yard in Virginia, all on their way here to the Middle East, to the waters near or surrounding the Iranian state. He's doing that in addition to a host of sanctions that his administration has imposed on Iran during the last year, including extraordinary remedy in the form of 25% tariffs on states like China who continue to do business with the Iranian regime. And that is all in addition to many things that are not being discussed publicly that will be leading to, hopefully in the next few days or weeks, the promised response to the horrifying mass murders that the Iranian regime is carrying out on freedom-loving, democracy-loving Iranians who just want a better life for themselves and for their children. And this president has not only done this and kept his word with respect to Iran, he's done this in Venezuela recently, where he's captured the head of the Venezuelan narco-terrorist state, Maduro, sent him off to stand trial in the Southern District of New York for a host of drug-related and human trafficking charges that have been pending against this man since 2020. He has brought an end to the illegal immigration that has really threatened the very social fabric of the United States, deliberately caused by the Biden administration as soon as that administration took office in 2021, letting millions of illegal aliens enter into the United States, including among them the most atrocious, heinous criminals that one can imagine. Some of that we're seeing the results of which now in the United States as the president seeks to have them removed and sent back to their countries of origin. He's also revitalized the economy. I don't know if you ever saw the economic results of the last quarter in the United States, something over 4% growth, gross domestic product, and the prospects for quarter 4, which has ended just on December 31st, are promising to be even more fantastic, in excess of 5% GDP. That is, for a nation like the United States, makes it comparable to the annual growth rates, even higher than in places like China, which have been growing at phenomenal rates. All of this due to his legislative package to extend the tax cuts of 2017 and what's called the Big, Beautiful Bill. But President Trump's triumphs in the foreign policy area are not limited to Iran. It's also, after all, you all remember just a few months ago, Operation Midnight Hammer, in Hebrew, Kelavi, Am Kelavi, I think was the name of the operation here, which enabled the United States to carry out its a tremendous success against the Iranian nuclear facilities in June of this past year. Also, the administration was actively involved in solving conflicts around the world which threatened the stability of the world international regime under literally all continents. I mentioned already Latin America. The president was actively succeeded in solving the conflict between Rwanda and the Congo in Africa. He did the same thing in Asia between Thailand and Cambodia. between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This president simply doesn't stop. In comparison to his predecessor, who had usually called a lid on his activities in the White House before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. People really admire and just are astounded by the amount of energy this 79-year-old president is able to muster, and what he has continued to do in really in a multiplicity of fields across the spectrum, not only in the foreign policy area, but in energy, in economy, even in the environmental area. These achievements are really superhuman, is how I would describe it. Now, another achievement that here we can take pride in Israel in leading the way is a recognition of a new state in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, called Somaliland. And this is a remarkable achievement for Israeli diplomacy, one that is being reviewed favorably, I can say, in Washington, as it considers recognizing formally the independence of this new African state, which is located in an area which has extraordinary geopolitical significance, not only for Israel but for the world, given the fact that much of the world's trade, at least before the Houthis became involved, was traveling through the Horn of Africa, up the Red Sea, into the Suez Canal. And hopefully that will be restored soon. How am I doing time-wise? You gotta let me know, because okay, because I'd like to also allow you to ask questions. I think you probably have a lot more questions for me than you did for Chaya, which is okay, and I encourage it. You know, you can talk to me about Greenland, anything you want, okay? I'll be glad to respond. One of the things I have to say is, look, the Trump administration is doing the best it can, and has done remarkable things. I've just recounted a few. But it isn't perfect, and there are challenges that remain. The American public, for example, is still making its decision about whether or not it likes President Trump's policy about tariffs, which has caused the American economy to explode on the one hand for the better, on the other hand, has resulted in a slowing down of the administration's effort to curtail inflation. It's still much better than it was in the previous administration, but it needs to be, it needs to continue. You've seen also on your TV screens these images coming from Minnesota, where people are trying to obstruct the work of of ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Administration, which has been tasked to remove illegal immigrants from the United States and send them back to their countries of origin. I can say this: we don't like to see those images. On the other hand, we really haven't encountered a situation where a sanctuary state like Minnesota and its governor and the mayor of Minneapolis, Frey, has decided that they're going to fight the federal government about enforcement and federal agents about enforcing federal law. Now, Donald Trump was asked to do something about the crime wave in Washington, D.C. That's where I was born and raised. I have a cousin there who's a confirmed Democrat. I mean, she is a total anti-Trumper. But she told me before, when I was just there, that she was afraid to go into her neighborhood grocery store because the criminals in Washington had, under the Democratic mayor there, had been routinely going in and engaging what's called smash and grab. They go in and they break down the showcases or the merchandise cases, and they steal the food and just walk out. Nobody did anything. President Trump said, listen, I'm responsible for Washington, D.C., too, or at least a major part of it. And he said, I'm going to do something about it. And what did he do? He sent in the National Guard. And within 2 weeks, the crime rate in Washington, D.C. plummeted to almost zero. Now my cousin, who will still vote, like a lot of them, Democratic in the November midterms, has decided that okay, Trump did something right. He's done a lot right. And we in Israel know about that. If you go on the street, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, when you go on the street in Israel and you talk to people about President Trump, I mean, they are almost unanimous in my experience in praising the work that he's done for us and the Jewish people and for peace in general. I didn't talk about Gaza. What about the 20 hostages, live hostages he brought home, and the 27 out of the 28 dead hostages that he also was instrumental in bringing back to their families? We still pray, of course, that Ron Gavili his body will be returned soon, and the president is determined to make that happen. At the same time, he inaugurated a regime to rebuild the Gaza and for the benefit of its citizens and for stability and peace in our area. Now here it's a very interesting problem because on the one hand, he has this 20-point plan which Israel has endorsed, and he created a coalition of nations here in the Middle East, including some of our enemies like Turkey and Qatar, to participate and to support the idea of a international effort to rebuild Gaza. And I think most of us are in favor of such a thing. We want to see the problem in Gaza resolved permanently. And we know in Israel that for that to happen, Hamas and its allies there, the Islamic Jihad, need to be completely disarmed and more, but at least disarmed. Now, the president is moving ahead with phase 2 of the program, which is the actual implementation of it. And as we know, he's formed a board of peace, he calls it, which he's going to chair, and there will be representatives from many of the coalition partners. He would like to see Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt be involved in that. Now, with respect to Qatar and Egypt, I have to say, I spoke out this morning on an Israeli radio station, that I don't agree. I mean, I'm the chairman of Republicans Overseas in Israel. I have full confidence in the President of the United States, and I will continue and avidly support the President of the United States to ensure that he gets not only the 300,000 some voters that he got in 2024, but maybe close to the 500,000 that we have in 2026 in the midterms. But I think that we have our own red lines. Israel has its own national security interests. So that's, I got the 5-minute warning, I'm going to close it up. I've said that I disagree. Prime Minister Netanyahu said he disagrees. And I think Prime Minister is right on this. We have to draw the line here at this point. Qatar and Turkey are determined to bring an end to the Jewish state through their financial, military, and diplomatic efforts. We cannot allow them to have a place at the table in Gaza. If they want to change their ways, that's another story. And so I've urged the President of the United States and his administration to reconsider that decision. In closing, the Republican perspective is one of triumphant optimism and rugged individualism, in stark contrast to the, quote, warm collectivism advocated by the Democratic Party as exemplified by the newly elected socialist mayor of New York City. We champion Trump's policies for their proven results: a booming economy, secure borders, ironclad alliances. And so, to you, I understand some of you are students here at Tel Aviv University, to the faculty, we know of at least 2 of you who are here, strive to be fair and objective and boldly embrace democracy as we do in Republicans overseas. And to the ambassadors, I think there are a few of you here. Can you raise your hand? You got one, all right. So understand that America's commitment to stability, freedom, and prosperity is unbreakable. Pass that on to your foreign ministries back home. I want to thank you for hearing me today. I want to thank Ms. Haupt for her kind comments, and I'd like to open it to questions. But I'll sign off with this one statement: America is back. Okay, sure.
Thank you for your presentation. Just have one question, please. Could you shed light on some of the factors President Trump might have considered to change his vote on striking the Iranian regime?
Well, again, I'm not an insider, but I'll try to give you my own assessment of it based on information that I have and whatnot. First of all, there is some question. There is a question whether or not he actually reversed himself on the timing of the strike. But I think it's fair to say, and I firmly believe this, that he is committed to carrying out his promise to respond to the atrocities of the Iranian regime, and that includes a kinetic strike against the Iranian regime. Now, how he's going to do it and when he's going to do it, we don't know. But as I said in the beginning of my remarks, he is bringing the resources here, massive resources in the form of 3 carrier support groups, okay, to the region, and that's a lot of firepower. He's reduced American footprint in Qatar, in the Doha, in the base outside of Doha. And he is, and we here in Israel are also getting ready for that. In fact, some of the reporting on this decision last week says that it was Israel, among others, that encouraged President Trump to postpone his strike, not because they didn't think it should be done, because they wanted to make sure that when it was done, it would be effective. And to be effective, you need the resources. So he's bringing those resources to the table. So I'm comfortable that he will continue to make good on his promise to the Iranian people to support them. He said just this morning or just late last night that he thinks it's time for a change in the leadership in Iran. That's the closest he's ever come for calling for regime change in that country, which is an extraordinary thing for him to say. And I think he understands, just as we do, that there's no recourse but to do that. Yeah, sure. Please.
In the event that the Republican candidate on our next presidential ticket is radically against the state of Israel, would the Republicans abroad in Israel still support them? And if not, what would you guys do?
Well, I'll tell you what I would do. You know, the first thing I did when I was Republicans abroad, but we are now Republicans overseas, but when I was Republicans abroad chairman back in 1992, you know who we endorsed for President of the United States? Bill Clinton. And you know, the Democrat. And you know why we did it? Because the Republican candidate and his Secretary of State, James Baker, George Bush the father, was the president at the time running for re-election, was making statements against the state of Israel. And I felt that was wrong and inappropriate. So by extension, if my party, which will not happen, actually nominates a candidate who's opposed to the state of Israel, which would be it would be suicidal in terms of his own political future in the United States, I will not support such a candidate. Okay? Yeah.
You said you were ready to talk about Greenland, so
That was an easy one. That was okay. Go ahead.
the Danish kingdom would welcome the deployment of U.S. military troops to Greenland,
The Danish government.
the Danish government.
Yeah.
And they would also be ready to negotiate deals regarding.
Are you Danish, by the way?
No,
Okay, French. Oh, well, okay. You're protecting Greenland now, right? You're saying your troops are to Nuuk. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
What's the point in continuing to claim Greenland territory, even though it threatens the alliance with NATO, with Europe, and it also is against the will of the Greenlandish people, which has claimed that it doesn't want to join the USA in any way. So why continuing to import these disputes?
Well, okay. So I think there's a wide consensus, at least in the United States, that Greenland is an important national security interest of the United States. I don't know if you all were aware, but Donald Trump. This is not an idea that originated with Donald Trump. as far back as 1867, when the United States purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire, okay, the United States made a similar offer. This is under the Andrew Johnson administration, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln, to the Danish government at that time to buy Greenland. The Danes refused. It dropped. In 1917, during World War I, the Americans made a similar proposal to the Danish government. The Danish government refused, but said, hey, will you take the Virgin Islands instead? So we took the Virgin Islands, okay. During World War II, America under the Franklin Roosevelt administration occupied Greenland, okay, to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Nazis, another European power. And after the Roosevelt administration came to an end after his death and Harry Truman became president in 1946, he again renewed the United States' offer to purchase Greenland from the Danes. The Danes refused, and the United States let it drop. But what they did in the 1950s was to enter into a agreement, the 1951 security agreement between the United States and the Kingdom of Denmark, which allowed the United States to bring its and to build military bases throughout Greenland without interference from the Danish government. That treaty, by the way, remains in effect. And a lot of people now saying, when they're to President Trump, well, why are you pushing for American control or occupation or acquisition of Greenland when you already have the right to station military troops there? Well, that's a fair question. I think he understands that the situation, the geographic, climatological, and geopolitical situation in the world has changed radically since 1951. And what the situation is now with the melting of the northern Arctic polar cap, you have now a real possibility that the shipping lanes in and around Greenland and across what used to be called the Northwest Passage, north of Canada, will now become navigable to commercial and military shipping. Now, in order to prevent, and you all know where Greenland is, it's closer to the United States than it is to Europe, or Denmark by far. In order to prevent Greenland from falling into hands of people, of organizations or countries like China and Russia, who have adversarial intentions, inimical intentions towards the United States and the West, Trump says, I think correctly, that we should take control of Greenland. But here is a solution that I think is elegant. You've heard of the Marshall Islands. You've heard of Palau. These are independent states in the Pacific that have association agreements with the United States of America. Now, they're independent countries. And that's something, by the way, the Greenlanders also want. They want to be independent, all 30,000 of them, okay? They're not particularly open to the idea of becoming a U.S. dependency. But one idea that needs to be discussed, and may well end up being the case, we'll see, is that the Greenland will finally be granted independence, and it will join in an association agreement with the United States, just as the Marshall Islands and Palau have. And I think that would be an elegant and an appropriate solution to both the legitimate needs of the United States and the aspirations of the Greenlanders. Anything else? Donna.
When we started working on Drew's issue back in June, we spoke a lot about removal of sanctions from Syrian regime, and you said yes, it can be done. And you remember the quote that only if minorities in Syria are not, like their rights not going to be.
You're talking about Syria now.
Yeah,
Syria. Okay.
See what's happening 8 months after from Druze to Kurds.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on that?
Sure. Okay. Listen, I have said it all along, and I made my voice very clear to the Trump administration, I'm not the only one, of course, that the decision to support the al-Jolani regime after the Assad government in Syria collapsed was a good one. And the United States, the Trump administration decided to remove sanctions. But I said, as you correctly indicated, at that time that the condition for removal of the U.S. sanctions and what they call the Caesar Act sanctions, again, from Syria should be a firm commitment and demonstrated commitment to protect the minorities in Syria, the Druze, the Christians, the Kurds, the Alawis, the Yazidis, and so on. And indeed, the executive order that came out repealing the sanctions included language of that effect. Is it enough? No. Is the administration doing enough to protect the minorities? I hope so. Just this week, this past week, a CENTCOM delegation was sent to sit with the Kurds in northeastern Syria in order to work with them and discuss with them about protecting them against onslaught by the Syrian regime headed by al-Julani. That seems to have failed. And the reports that we're getting from the Kurdish commanders in northern Syria is that the Syrian army has not only occupied the town of Tapka, but is also now driving and occupied oil fields in northeast Syria and is violating its undertakings to the American administration. What the American administration will do in response to this, I don't know. But my response is, do not sit by with folded arms. You cannot let this go unanswered. Okay?
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
So we will have to move on to the next session. Our final session today is going to be exploring how the United States engages with the Arab world and Turkey amid shifting alliances, regional conflicts, and changing global power dynamics. Our first speaker in this session is Dr. Brandon Friedman from Tel Aviv University. Dr. Friedman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you all for bearing with me and sticking around to the last panel of the day. My thanks to the Irwin Cotler Institute for Democracy, Human Rights, and Justice. My thanks to Professor Uriah Sharit, its director, and to Dr. Carl Yonker for the invitation to be here with you all today, and to Maria Lul for the wonderful introduction. I am a senior research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies here at Tel Aviv University, right down the hall, in fact. We are the oldest research center in Israel focused on the Middle East and Middle Eastern politics. And I'm going to try to focus my remarks today on the state of U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, which touch on a lot of regional developments, and I'm happy to address any other regional issues that come up during the course that you might want to ask about, and I'll try to leave some time for questions. So for the past 10 years, the U.S.-Saudi relationship has experienced profound change, characterized by a crisis of confidence. In the brief time I have today, I want to explain how and why it has changed, and the new effort we've seen in the last year to reset the relationship by creating a new basis for mutual benefit and confidence, what us academics might refer to as interdependence. The origins of the U.S.-Saudi relationship trace back to the 1930s, when the U.S. oil companies began prospecting for oil in the kingdom. And this ultimately led to the establishment of Aramco and the very famous meeting on the USS Quincy between Ibn Saud, King Abdulaziz, the first king of the modern Saudi kingdom established in 1932, and FDR, the American president, in 1945. Saudi oil became vital to rebuilding the post-World War II economies of Western Europe and Japan. And I think that point is key. Under the Marshall Plan, between 1948 and 1951, the Marshall Plan provided $1.2 billion for the purchase of oil. More than 10% of the total Marshall Plan aid came in the form of subsidized oil. 56% of the oil that went to France, the UK, Italy, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway after World War II was financed by the United States. And 75% of that oil was sourced outside of the US. The point there is that there's often a misconception, a sort of conventional wisdom that the United States was somehow dependent on Middle Eastern or Saudi oil, but in fact, it was the US subsidizing Middle Eastern oil to go to American allies or defeated American enemies after World War II, in particular Germany and Japan, that formed the basis of the post-war arrangements that became central to what today is oftentimes referred to in an offhand way as the world order or the international community. Saudi oil was vital not to the US market. The US remained an oil power until 1970 roughly. It was to the US allies that oil was vital, and they came to rely on Saudi oil and Middle Eastern oil as a whole to rebuild their economies. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US deepened on three particular fronts that are of crucial importance to understand. First, Saudi Arabia began investing their massive post-73 oil wealth in the US economy in exchange for US, or in particular, private American companies' help in rebuilding or modernizing the kingdom's public infrastructures and governmental institutions. Second, the Saudis began financing the US wars against Soviet proxies in the Third World in what came to be known as Cold War 2.0. Particularly, the two best examples that come to mind are the war against a massive number of Soviet-financed Cuban troops in Angola in the 1970s, and the financing of the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s. It's critical to understand that there was an ideological glue cementing the US-Saudi relationship from the mid-1970s up until the end of the Cold War. That ideological glue no longer exists. The third front was, and it was mentioned this morning in one of the first lectures, is that the United States gave way in the early 1970s to Saudi Arabia as the world or the global economy's swing producer. That means the Saudis, since the 1970s, have been able to produce oil cheaper and faster than any other producer in the global market. And the oil is, to a certain degree, with certain limitations, a global market, which means the Saudis have the ability to modulate the global price of oil in a way that almost no other actor in the market has. And that remains a huge factor today. In fact, the reason we saw the Biden presidency go to Saudi Arabia in the summer of 2022 and the famous fist bump between the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and President Biden was in part because the Biden administration felt that they needed Saudi help in modulating the price of oil prior to American midterm elections in 2022. Meaning the Saudis have continued to play a massive role in influencing the global economy because it's not just the global oil market. Oil markets affect global inflation, which is one of the most important factors in stabilizing a global economy. So the Saudi ability to influence, not control, but influence, inflation in the global economy makes the Saudi role as the global oil swing producer incredibly important. And so this relationship, which again, three fronts to it from the 1970s forward, the global ideological anti-Soviet Union, the role of Saudi oil production, and the American role in helping modernize the institutions of Saudi Arabia, and of course, the fact that the Saudis have been a sympathetic swing producer has combined over the years to bring the US and Saudi Arabia together. In the 1980s, the US built an extensive, in the 1990s, after the first Gulf War, which you could say was the peak expression of this US-Saudi relationship. The US sent more than 500,000 troops into Saudi Arabia and the Gulf in order to defend Saudi oil fields and the Saudi regime from potential threats from Saddam Hussein after he had invaded Kuwait in 1990 and what became the first Gulf War in 1991. After that war, the US built an extensive number of military bases throughout the Gulf, and these military bases became a symbol for the American commitment to what some people refer to as this oil for security relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And what that means was the interdependence that the Saudis saw in the relationship was the Saudis will play a sympathetic role to American interests in the global oil market and in the global economy as a whole, and in exchange there will be an unspoken understanding that the Americans have a deep national security investment in protecting the Saudi regime. Now, it was this oil for security arrangement, not Al-Qaeda's attack on the U.S. On 9/11. It was when the oil for security relationship began to erode in the early 2000s that we began to see a change in the U.S.-American relationship. What led to the erosion of the oil for security relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia? The United States experienced, as many of you might know, a fracking revolution, which meant unconventional shale oil and gas, beginning in roughly 2007 and extending up until today, which transformed the U.S. into, again, the world's largest combined oil and gas producer. In roughly the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, the U.S. became a net oil and gas importer, no longer a global energy power. That role as a global energy power, to a certain extent, returned in the period between 2007 and 2015. And in the Saudi eyes, this turned the United States into a market competitor. It also internally in the United States, I would argue erroneously, led some to believe that the U.S. was now energy independent, if you believe in such an expression, and fundamentally eroded the mutual belief on both the American side and the Saudi side there was an interdependence, the kind of interdependence that had existed since at least the Yom Kippur War in 1973 up until the fracking revolution beginning in 2007. Now, there's a U.S. internal political dimension to this as well, the fracking revolution. In U.S. politics, the Democrats began pushing or advocating for a net zero agenda, meaning the energy transition. The Democrats believed the science revolving climate change. I'm agnostic on the issue. I'm not enough of an expert to know one way or the other. But the Democratic Party began pushing the United States towards embracing a green agenda, embracing what became known, or what is known amongst the experts as the Green Revolution. And this was evident in the 2015 Paris Accords. And the Saudis saw this as a threat to accelerate an energy transition that would lead to peak demand, peak oil demand, not peak oil supply. The Saudi economy, for those of you who don't know, 80% of export revenues roughly are generated by oil. The 40% of Saudi GDP is dependent on oil, despite Vision 2030, which I could talk about. The Saudi economy is overwhelmingly dependent on its oil economy. And so anything that brings this transition away from oil, particularly from its largest customers, closer, potentially is a national security threat to the kingdom's very survival. And so we saw this play out during the Biden administration. I can talk about it a little bit later if we have some more time. For the Republicans, the energy transition has also been important because Republican political support comes in large part from U.S. oil and gas interests who sought to press the Saudis in recent years on pricing so that price would remain not low enough to destroy this new U.S. oil and gas industry, these small fracking companies that have emerged in the last 15 years, and not so high that U.S. consumers would pay this enormous tax at the pump, which became an issue after the COVID lockdowns when the American economy was reopening in 2021, 2022, and it's why Biden felt that he had to go to Saudi Arabia repeatedly, or appeal to the Saudis repeatedly in 2021, 2022, to lower the price of oil by producing more oil, because he didn't want to sacrifice the Democratic Party's green agenda. Meaning he didn't want to give the go-ahead for the U.S. oil and gas industry to produce more oil and gas, because there would be a political backlash within his own party. And so there is, you could argue, bipartisan pressure in the American political system on the Saudi relationship as a result of this new fracking revolution. At the same time that this was happening, that the Americans' oil for security relationship with the Saudis was eroding, the perception in Saudi Arabia was the Americans were withdrawing their security support for the kingdom. Okay? Now, how did this unfold in the Saudi eyes between 2070 and 2020? First, the Saudis were very uncomfortable with the Obama administration's decision in 2010, 2011 to withdraw all 150,000 American troops from Iraq without negotiating a future status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government. And the sense was in Saudi Arabia that the Americans had their fill of Iraq in the Middle East, that Obama campaigned on getting the Americans out of Iraq. He wanted to pursue an agenda that was not focused on what was perceived in America as a failed or failing war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And so there was a sense that the Americans were trying to disengage or withdraw, okay? This is the perception. I'm not arguing the reality now. That perception was reinforced with the Arab Spring when the U.S. abandoned fairly quickly the Mubarak regime, who was a loyal American security partner for 30 years. When the Obama administration refused support to Mubarak during the Arab Spring uprising, this created a sense, both in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the region, again, that the Americans were no longer interested in playing the traditional role that they had played in the Middle East for decades, and particularly post-Cold War. In 2011, the United States did play a role in toppling the Gaddafi regime in Libya, but they quickly withdrew their forces and played no role in stabilizing Libya after toppling the regime, and there was some sense again that the Americans were seeking to withdraw from their commitments in the region, or at least avoid additional commitments. The Syria Red Line, Obama in the summer of 2012 had said that the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons was a red line for the American administration, and then what became perceived as a failure to enforce that red line in 2013 reinforced the perception that the U.S. Was no longer interested in playing the role it had played in the past. This was again reinforced with the Iranian nuclear deal, in which Saudi Arabia and others were cut out of the process of that negotiation between 2013 and 2015. And then, just as the Assad regime seemed on the cusp of collapsing in the summer of 2015, Russia and Iran, immediately after signing the nuclear deal, sent ground forces and air support to Assad and basically ensured that the Assad regime would survive for another 9 years. And the Americans, the perception was that the Americans stood idle and watched this, unwilling to potentially jeopardize the nuclear deal by opposing the Russian and Iranian intervention. And finally, and perhaps most consequentially for the Saudi perception of the American reliability as a security partner, what became, between 2015 and 2018, an increasingly sharp critique of the Saudi war in Yemen, which began in the spring of 2015. The notion that the Saudis were creating a huge humanitarian catastrophe by fighting the Houthis in Yemen, and that was a war that had to urgently be stopped, as if the Saudis were the only group with agency in that war, became urgent and priority, in fact, either the first or second priority of the new Biden administration when it took office in 2021. And finally, it was a bipartisan sense of U.S. unreliability. During the first Trump administration, between December 12th and December 19th, 2018, the Trump administration had committed to keeping American forces in Syria. A week later, they reversed on that commitment after Trump's conversation with the Turkish President Erdogan. And this promise that Trump had made, particularly to Gulf allies like Saudi Arabia, was considered a sign that okay, perhaps in the sense of Americans willing to play this role as stabilizer in the region, that Trump is in fact no different than Obama. And in fact, this was reinforced in a very visceral way for the Saudis in September 2019, when the Iranians and the Houthis attacked the huge Saudi oil refinery complexes at Al-Bakhaik and Al-Khurais, which was a devastating attack that took massive amounts of oil offline. And the Americans basically did nothing. And this was a double shock for the Saudis. One is they didn't expect the Iranians to have the capabilities to execute such a pinpoint attack on their oil facilities. And second, the Saudis expected the Carter Doctrine, which had basically been the American policy in the Gulf since the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and 80, that the Americans would use American military power to ensure the continuation of the free flow of oil from the Gulf to global markets. When Trump did nothing, it was basically, in practice, viewed as an abandonment of a long-standing American policy with respect to the Gulf. And so all of this is to say, all of the preceding points, is that the Saudis came to view the American security partnership as unreliable. Okay? And beginning in 2019 and 2020, the Saudis began recalibrating their foreign policy, and I would argue that this became part of a Saudi search for strategic independence. Okay, what some people have referred to as hedging, I don't really buy that term because I don't think American military protection can be replaced by any other actor, whether it's China, Russia, or anyone else. But the Saudis have sought to diversify their relationships, which means not putting all of their security eggs in one basket, developing important relationships with the Russians and the Chinese that make them feel invested in the Saudi regime and the continuation of the kingdom's survival. But at the same time, and this is perhaps the most important point I want to leave you with today, the Saudis are seeking to create a new interdependence with the United States, to reset what was known as the oil for security. And I would argue the Saudis want this new relationship to be AI for security, okay, or AI for Saudi investment. The Saudis envision in the future a digital economy, a fourth industrial revolution, to use the Davos terminology if you buy into that, powered by artificial intelligence. And they want to become the infrastructure and back office for this global transformation. They want the world's, and in particular markets like Asia and Africa, they want the world's digital AI infrastructure to be run from Saudi Arabia. They want Saudi energy, Saudi data centers, Saudi-produced semiconductors, and connectivity through Saudi Arabia to drive the AI revolution. And they're betting on the United States to help make that happen. The Saudis perceive that they have a comparative advantage in this field because in order to build out the digital infrastructure for AI, you need massive data centers. And what do you need for massive data centers? You need energy, okay? Which is currently what everyone's scrambling to develop. How is this massive AI build-out going to be powered? Well, the Saudis have a lot of energy. They are a global leader in fossil fuel and renewables and potentially nuclear. And for those of you who may not be aware, the Trump administration during its first term actively sought to sell the Saudis nuclear technology without the most stringent forms of controls on those technologies. It didn't work the first time, but that doesn't mean it may not work the second. The United States sees the Saudi investment fund, the Sovereign Investment Fund, what's known as the PIF, it's $900 billion, investing $40 billion in artificial intelligence as a potential difference maker in transforming the U.S. in what is popularly perceived as going to be the next arms race. Who's going to win the race to dominate the field in artificial intelligence? And the idea is that to root Saudi artificial intelligence in U.S. standards, companies, and chips, creating reciprocal technology and capital flows and greater interdependence. If the U.S. depends on a healthy Saudi digital infrastructure, the Saudis are betting this will renew the U.S. incentive to protect the kingdom if the kingdom needs protecting. Now, and again, there have been lots of reports, and they're aspirational more than anything else, about a Pax Silica. The U.S. is trying to engage not just the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, but also that of Qatar and the United Arab Emirates in order to fund the U.S. private AI expansion. This potentially is good news for those who would like to see the U.S. drive a Saudi-Israeli normalization process. And I would argue things have been moving in recent months against that. But potentially, if this vision can be fulfilled, potentially there is a role, an important role in place for Israel. And I'll leave you with this final point. I thought the two presentations this morning were outstanding. But they were sort of left you with a feeling of pessimism, right? And I would argue, and I do it not in the interest of advocacy because I'm a scholar, but I would argue there's been a lot of talk in the last 15 years about a multipolar international system. Now, I'm a historian, not an international relations scholar. I'm not sure I fully believe in the idea of multipolarity. I think sometimes it espoused by international players who want to see power devolve away from the United States. But I think what we've seen, if we're looking around the Middle East, whether it's events in Iran, events in Syria that were mentioned a few minutes ago, Lebanon or Gaza, I would say America still stands at the center of the international solar system's orbit, if you want to use the idea of polarity. That the idea of multipolarity was someone's aspiration and more of a myth than reality. If we see events on the ground, we still see a world of American primacy, for better and for worse, if only American elites believe in it, okay? And there seems to be dramatic swings in whether one group of American elites still believe in American privacy and another group of American elites no longer believe in it. In other words, what will American primacy be in the service of moving forward? Will it be in the service of American national interest defined narrowly and transactionally, as perhaps we're seeing now? Or will we see American national interests defined more broadly as they had been for most of the 20th century? And I would argue I don't have, and no one really has a good answer to that question yet, but that is the key question. It's not whether American primacy exists or doesn't exist. What we've seen is when the Americans choose to exercise their power, they have an unequaled capacity to do so still, even if it's not what it used to be. The question is how they choose to use it, and of course, whether they believe that they should use it. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Friedman? Okay. So we will be moving to our final speaker of the day, who is Dr. Galia Lindenstrauss from the Institute for National Security Studies. Dr. Lindenstrauss, please proceed.
So thank you. It's always an honor to speak in events, but the Irwin Cotler Institute event is really, I'm really privileged to speak with you today, and I'm thankful for that. So Mr. Zell already mentioned the Board of Peace that was announced during the weekend, and the fact that President Erdogan was asked to join the Board of Peace. And I think it left a lot of Israelis puzzled, and most Israelis objected the fact that President Trump decided to involve President Erdogan. And it points to the bigger question of why does Trump like Erdogan so much? I mean, it doesn't go a week by without Trump saying something about President Erdogan. He's a friend, I like him, he's a tough guy, but he's good. Don't worry about him, he says to Netanyahu. Whenever I needed him, he was there for me. And we really see this personal affinity between these two leaders. But as an analyst, and probably the only advantage we have as an analyst that follows a topic for a long time, is that we have perspective. And I remember the Obama days, which also Obama said good things about Erdogan. During the Arab awakening, Obama said about Erdogan, he's one of the 5 leaders I speak with. He's one of 5 leaders I respect. And here you have a picture of President Obama visiting Turkey, and he later said this was a great visit. So I remember also that during Obama times there was hope that Erdogan would deliver for the US. And that brings me to the point of this presentation, which is we are in a peak in Turkish-US relations for sure. But echoing what Brandon's presentation, there's a lot of also tension in underlining Turkish-US relations, a lot of issues that have been in dispute for many years, and that even if things look very shiny on the outside, when you deep down, things are not that great. I have to say, though, that when I look at Biden's presidency, there I would say even when you looked at the shiny aspect, it wasn't that shiny. The Turks were quite disappointed when Biden was elected, and I have to say Erdogan was never invited to the White House during Biden's term. And during the first phone call that Biden calls Erdogan after he's elected, he tells him he's going to recognize tomorrow the Armenian genocide, which obviously Turkey has put a lot of effort into denying. So that was not a very good good relationship. Also, because of the war in Ukraine, in the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, of course, also the U.S. understood the importance of Turkey. And when the issue of the accession of Sweden and Finland to join NATO was on the table, Turkey first objected, and it took quite a lot of persuading to make Turkey agree to this, to Sweden and Finland joining NATO. And this points to another aspect that we should look at it in a historical perspective, which is Turkey's NATO membership. On the one hand, Turkey has been in NATO since 1952, and overall has participated in a lot of NATO missions, and this has been important, being the second largest army in NATO. However, many points, it was always difficult to bring the Turks to act. You had to convince them, you had to persuade them. So it was not an easy partner in NATO, and that remains till today. But as I said, now in Trump's term, he likes Erdogan, and I think it's two reasons that we have to. Two reasons can help us explain why he likes Erdogan. First of all, from Trump's perspective, Erdogan delivers. When he speaks to him, things get done. He doesn't have to speak with bureaucracy. The US bureaucracy doesn't have to speak with the Turkish bureaucracy. He just makes a phone call to Erdogan, and things are done the way they agree. So that's a very good thing from Trump's perspective. The second thing is that Trump perceives Erdogan as a winner. He's not only reliable, but he's a winner. And from Trump's perspective, Erdogan is the one who won the civil war in Syria. He's the one who got the result he was wanting to, was aiming for. And this is, for Trump's perspective, also very important, that this leader is a winner. And that, I think, two elements are very important in understanding how Trump relates to Erdogan. But as I said, there are still issues that remain not necessarily a bone of contentions, but issues that have built up distrust between the sides over the years. And this issue of the support of the US to the Kurdish forces in northern Syria has been one of the things that had poisoned the relationship between Turkey and the US for quite some time. From Turkish perspective, the Kurds in Syria are an extension of the Kurdish underground in Turkey, the PKK, and hence when the US supports the Kurdish forces in northern Syria, it supports a terror organization. From the US perspective, the Kurds have been very instrumental in fighting ISIS. Now, this issue really has caused a lot of concern, and this is the Kurdish forces in northern Syria, and this is the picture of the PKK leader Öcalan, which is in prison in Turkey. Just in these minutes, I have to say, this issue seems to be settling in the sense that the Syrian government is taking control over the areas in which Kurdish forces in Syria have been pretty much throughout the Syrian civil war. But still, these pictures of CENTCOM people shaking hands with people that Turkey considers as terrorists is something that has an underlying effect on Turkish-US relations, and I don't think it will be forgotten soon. Another issue that poisoned the relations between the US and Turkey for many years was the fact that Fethullah Gulen, which is a cleric, a dead cleric, took refuge in the United States. And from Turkish perspective, or from Erdogan and his supporters' perspective, he was the one behind the failed coup in 2016. And Turkey asked the US to hand him over. The US refused. And this was, again, a big issue that was resolved only with the death of Gulen. Had he not died, the issue would have still been in place. And of course, his followers are still in the US and still lobbying today against Turkey. If in the past, when Erdogan and Gulen were partners, these Gulen supporters were Turkey's soft power. Today, they are the strongest lobbyists against Turkey in foreign capitals. So the cleric is dead, so that's a good thing, but still, the Gulen network is not completely dead, and it's still operating also in the US. The last issue, which I think is a big bone of contention and has not been solved yet compared to the two other topics, has been the fact that Turkey bought the S-400 system from Russia in 2017. It arrived to Turkey in 2019, and it was tested in 2020. From NATO's perspective, this is a Trojan horse. The fact that Turkey, that has American jets and was part of the F-35 program, but the system is, from the US perspective and NATO perspective, a Trojan horse, and it has still not been solved. Now, I have to say, Turkey has not, it's been a big blunder. Turkey paid $2.5 billion for the system. It is not operational. It is not in use. Okay, because of the tensions between Turkey and NATO, I let the artificial intelligence characterize it, and they called it the $2.5 billion shelf ornament, which is not a very good compliment to the fact that Turkey bought this. This is a big issue, and it caused Turkey to be kicked out of the F-35 project, which, as I said, it was a partner to. It produced some of the parts, which it also gained monetary benefit from, and it was supposed to get 100 F-35s. And it got nothing. So that is an issue. The money that Turkey already paid for the F-35, it's not, they didn't get it back for the Americans yet. That's definitely an issue. And today there again talks about what will happen with the S-400. Some say that Erdogan has already asked Putin to take it back. Some say maybe there will be an agreement that Turkey would give it to a country which Russia also sees pretty much favorably, let's say Azerbaijan, or there would be some agreement on supervision, outside supervision, that the system is indeed not being used. But this issue is far from being settled between Turkey and the US. Now, I have to say, because this is the second term of Trump, we have also experience with the dark side of Trump vis-a-vis Turkey. And Trump was also very tough on Turkey, and he was actually the first president to impose the CAATSA sanctions on Turkey. He was the one who basically kicked out Turkey from the F-35 project because it bought the S-400. And also there is this story, I don't know if you remember, there was a pastor in Turkey that was taken to prison. Basically, probably he was taken to prison in Turkey because he was a missionary and they didn't like that fact, but they dumped on him all sorts of accusations that he was cooperating with Gulen movement, or that he was cooperating with the Turkish underground, with the PKK, and that basically he was cooperating with terror. He had a lot of support from the evangelist lobby, and they pushed Trump to make a hard time for Turkey. And indeed, when he wanted the pastor back, he caused the Turkish currency to fall. Okay, he imposed tariffs on Turkey. So he also knows to be tough on Turkey. And that also points to me that I don't think this is a completely harmonious relationship today between Turkey and the US. But Turkey is very useful, I have to admit. And Turkey has always been useful because of its geographical location. And today this is very clear in the case of Ukraine. Basically, Erdogan is the one who mediates with Putin from NATO's side. He mediated the grain deal. He mediated some hostages return deals. Today, he is in line with Trump's ideas of how to end the war in Ukraine. So he's useful in that respect. And today also it should be mentioned that when the Europeans look at the Americans, feel that they are not going to help them as they expected. They look around, who has a good defense industry, who has a big military. They look around, they see Turkey. So today Turkey is very much courted in European capitals, and that gives it definitely leverage in the international arena. Also, as I mentioned earlier, Trump sees Erdogan as a winner in Syria. And because Trump put his bet on Ashara, because Trump has decided that Ashara is a handsome guy and should be supported, that means that Trump thinks Turkey is a key to Syria's future. and also in this respect is very much attuned to what the Turks want. Also in Gaza, and here again I point to what I started with, which is the dismay in Israel to why Trump thinks that Turkey as a supporter of Hamas and including Turkey as a supporter of Hamas is a good idea in the day after in Gaza. But again, from the US perspective, once Turkey was on board, that brought about the ceasefire agreement, that brought about the return of the live hostages and the deceased hostages and most of the deceased hostages to Israel. And hence, it's a good idea to involve Turkey in Gaza. And, but this is, of course, something that Israel voices concern about, and rightfully so, I have to agree. But as I said, Turkey, I'm again suspectful of how harmonious Turkish-US relations is, because in many points of time, Turkey is in the wrong side, and Turkey supports those who the US is against. So, for example, here you see Erdogan and with Maduro. Erdogan with Maduro were very good. Erdogan really liked Maduro. Erdogan helped Maduro with evading sanctions on gold, for example. There were rumors that Maduro was offered to go to Turkey instead to the prison in the US, and he declined. But this is an example where Turkey was on the wrong side. Now, I have to admit, they haven't said anything. They haven't said, see, Erdogan didn't say something very strong after Maduro was arrested. But still, it points to where Erdogan was and where the US was. And also with Iran. Today, Turkey says it opposes a military intervention with Iran. Turkey was one of the countries which supposedly this 25% tariff over trading with Iran is supposed to be imposed on. Let's see if it really will be imposed. But again, it looks like Turkey is not completely in the right side. So I will conclude by saying there is still a persistence of US-Turkey tensions, and despite the very good personal relations between Trump and Erdogan, they can't be completely wiped off the table. Brandon didn't like the word hedging, but let's say Turkey looking into other options. I agree, for example, that you will never hear Erdogan say he wants to leave NATO, for example. He will say bad things about the EU. He will never say he wants to leave NATO. But Turkey is also forming better relations with Russia and China. And that, again, translated to the buying of the S-400 system, and that was a big blunder that resulted in the kicking out of Turkey from the F-35 project. The second thing is the autocratic churn in Turkey. And now, I think it's very clear why the Democrats and why Biden had a hard time with what Turkey was doing inside its domestic policies. And you would argue that Trump actually likes Erdogan because he is autocratic. But I would say the baggage that comes with an autocratic leader, which is paranoia, which is all sorts of belief in conspiracy theories, which means that people are chosen not because they're good, but because they're loyal. This baggage also affects US-Turkish relations when there is when Trump is in power. I mean, you can't ignore the baggage that comes with an autocratic leader. Brandon, again, I echo your remarks, but I think it's good to understand that many Middle Eastern countries are not completely happy with the US. And from Turkish perspective, the US has not always been reliable. And many times when they felt threatened from the missile threats in the region, they felt they had to beg Patriot missiles from other NATO members, and they felt that that the US and NATO were not completely reliable, that they can't count on Article 5 really to come to their help if they're going to be attacked. We have long-time anti-American feelings in Turkey. They relate also to anti-colonial feelings, to resentment on how the end of the Ottoman Empire occurred. You can, they exist, and when you want, you can flood them, and there will be attention to them. Another big issue, and here I think Israel-Turkish relations is a big obstacle in advancing Trump's idea with regard to Turkey in Gaza, is that Turkey has an aggressive stance towards US allies. Okay, how Erdogan speaks about Netanyahu is a problem for the US. How Erdogan speaks about Greece is a problem. How Erdogan acts towards Cyprus is an issue. So at the end of the day, these are U.S. allies, and the U.S. has to choose, and it's not easy to choose among who do you like better, Turkey or Israel. Turkey, also I have to say, is not currently a status quo actor. It's one thing to deal with a status quo actor. It's a very different thing to deal with a revisionist actor, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. And here again, the U.S. will have problems when its allies are threatened. Turkey also criticizes the world order and doesn't think necessarily that the U.S. should be the leader of the world order. As I said, in times of crisis, Turkey did not necessarily feel the US and the EU were on her side. It felt that it disregarded the plight of the Turkish Cypriot before the 1974 invasion. It felt that the Europeans were not necessarily aware enough to the PKK threat. One of the things that Turkey wanted in order for it to be on board with Sweden joining the NATO was that that Sweden would be harsher towards PKK exiles that were residing in Sweden. So this issue again doesn't feel. At some points, Turkey did not feel that the EU was attentive to its needs. Or the US, and also we had arms embargo, not the US, I mean with regard to Cyprus we also had US arms embargo, but specifically with regard to the PKK, we had, for example, Canadian arms embargo on Turkey, and this is only 2019 I'm talking, this is not long history, so this was a big issue. And conclude by saying that even, again, if on the face of it, it looks very shiny and they're all smiling, there's big issues that have to be addressed. And for example, the CAATSA sanctions, this issue of S-400, the F-35, this is also things that the Congress is involved, so even if you have the Republicans on board, you also have to convince the Democrats. And here there's a strong lobbying of Israel and Greece and Armenia and etc. That are making it harder for Turkey in the Congress, and these are things like the CAATSA Act. It's not something that is easily reversible. Even if there won't be, Turkey won't get the F-35, even with regard to engines. Turkey is now building its fifth generation jet, and it needs US engines, and even with regard to engines, it's not sure that the US will provide. The SDF, the Kurdish issue, yes, today it looks, if you look at the X feed, it will look like, yes, this is a good day for Turkey and that things are going well for Turkey in northern Syria. But at the end of the day, you have in Turkey a Kurdish minority of around 20%. And if it would not be gained rights, then the issue of the Kurds will remain at one level or another an issue. And always you can easily tell your domestic public, they don't really want rights, they're just terrorists. And that leads to these grievances about how the US in the past cooperated with what Turkey sees as Kurdish terrorists. And Gaza, as you well know, Gaza is not an easy thing to solve, even if you build a board of peace, and even if you include Erdogan, this is not what is going to solve the issue of Gaza. And hence, I believe this will be something that will remain in dispute between, for sure, between Israel and Turkey, but also as a byproduct also between Turkey and the US. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions before we close off the session?
I think it's safe to say that Azerbaijan is closer to Turkey than it is to Israel. Therefore, do you think that the increasing tensions between Israel and Turkey can also be harmful to the relationship between Azerbaijan and Israel?
So Azerbaijan is very interesting because it follows the 1990s regional order, not the current order. If I look at it very generally, I would say we have today a sort of axis between Greece, Cyprus, Israel, UAE, and India. And the contrary axis is, I would say, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and you can say other add-ons, but let's keep it at Turkey Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and there is even talk, which I don't buy, but and I'm sure Brandon would also be a little bit skeptic of a Muslim NATO. And the only piece that doesn't fit well is Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan also has very good relations with Turkey and with Pakistan, but it has, as you mentioned, good relations with Israel. And from Azerbaijan perspective, they give Israel credit for the fact that they won in the current rounds against the Armenians. They find that buying Israel's defense industry products is good, not necessarily because they're good products, which they are, but also because it gives them some independence in their foreign policy. Just being dependent on, they also live in a difficult neighborhood. They have Russia, they have Iran, they have, so they think that it's good to have a relationship with Israel, not to be too dependent on Turkey, not to be too dependent on Russia. And so Azerbaijan is the only piece that doesn't fit. And in the past, why did I say 1990s? Because Israel, Turkish, Azerbaijan triangular relations was developed in the 1990s with the encouragement of the US. And as I said, Israel-Azerbaijan relations still hold. And Azerbaijan has tried to mediate between Israel and Turkey. So we had talks between Israel and Turkey with regard to Syria in Azerbaijan with, again, US encouragement. And that has been fruitful. We have a hotline between Israel and Turkey with regard to Syria. Again, things that were discussed in Baku. And also today, Azerbaijan supplies gas to Syria, but it is also investing in Israel's gas industry. So you don't have to have too much imagination to envision that you will have the Arab pipeline taking Israeli gas with Azerbaijani investors going from Egypt through Jordan to Syria. And yeah, Azerbaijan has had overall a positive role in relaxing tensions, but it's not easy for Azerbaijan that Israel-Turkish relations are so tense.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lindenstrauss. As we close today's conference, I would like to thank all our speakers for their valuable contributions today. Thank you to the Irwin Cotler Institute for Democracy, Justice, and Human Rights, the Diplomats Club, and Tel Aviv University for hosting this event. We'd like to invite you to take a copy of the Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry's latest For a Righteous Cause report before you leave. And we'd like to thank you all for your attendance and your engagement, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next event. Thank you so much.